So, what if the most passionate pursuits in life, like, falling deeply in love or that real drive to understand the universe, what if they weren't just about emotion or intellect as we see them today?
Right. What if, back in the Renaissance, these things were seen as being fundamentally tied up with, well, with magic, with the power of imagination itself?
Exactly. Like inherently connected to unseen forces working just under the surface of things. It's a pretty different way of looking at the world.
Completely different.
Welcome to another deep dive, everyone. We're stepping back again, exploring this really fascinating, maybe even a little unsettling perspective from the Renaissance.
Our source is Ioan Couliano's brilliant book on Eros and magic in the Renaissance, a fantastic read.
And we're really zeroing in today, aren't we? Focusing on one specific section that kind of pulls back the curtain.
That's right. We're diving into chapter 3, pages 53 through 86. It's called Dangerous Liaisons. And it's dense, no doubt, but it's incredibly rewarding. It explores how these major Renaissance figures, people you've definitely heard of, like Marsilio Ficino, Giordano Bruno, how they thought about psychology, philosophy, science, and magic. But crucially, they didn't see them as separate boxes.
They saw them working together.
Exactly. Operating together through things like phantasms, memory, and, well, desire. Eros.
So our mission here, our goal for this deep dive, is basically to guide you through these specific pages. We want to unpack the core ideas here.
Understand how they connected things that seem worlds apart to us now.
Yeah.
Intense emotions, complex memory techniques, even magical operations.
Yeah, and pull out those surprising nuggets, the details that really show you this profoundly different way of understanding the mind and its place in the universe. It's almost like getting a secret map, isn't it?
A map to a lost way of thinking, definitely. A way that really shaped that whole era.
And we know some of this stuff can sound pretty complex, even a bit strange compared to how we think now, scientifically or psychologically.
For sure. It's alien territory in some ways. But by focusing on the what and the why that Couliano lays out in these pages, we hope to give you a really clear window into that historical worldview.
A worldview that wasn't just academic, right? It had real-world implications.
Absolutely. For everything from personal health to trying to influence events or other people or even, spirits.
Okay, let's dive in. Let's unpack this Dangerous Liaisons chapter.
Sounds good.
So the book starts this section, pages 53 onwards, by bringing in some real heavyweights, Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola.
Giants of the era, no question.
And right off the bat, the text notes something interesting. It says their initial, perfect understanding, this close intellectual bond they had, it didn't actually last very long.
Yeah, that's a key detail Couliano highlights early on. It helps differentiate them. Initially, they were sort of lumped together in the astrological philosophical terms of the day. They were both seen as Saturnian types.
Saturnian, what does that signify here?
It meant they were thought to have a melancholy temperament, suited for deep, solitary contemplation, digging into profound truths, often theological ones. Think intense, inward-looking thinkers.
Okay.
But, and this is the point the text makes quickly, their personal realities were quite different under that shared label.
And the description of Ficino here, wow. It's not the picture of some serene ivory tower philosopher. Not at all.
Not even close. Couliano uses Ficino's own words and descriptions from others to paint this picture of a man really burdened physically and psychologically.
How so?
Well, he was hunchbacked, he had a slight stammer, and he was prone to these incredibly severe bouts of melancholic despair, like truly debilitating.
Just feeling down or more serious?
Way more serious. The text mentions one episode where the melancholy was so overwhelming he almost died of starvation, just couldn't bring himself to eat. For Ficino, this wasn't just some abstract philosophical idea. It was a real, personal, life-threatening condition he battled constantly.
Wow. That's intense. So how did he handle that? How did he cope with such deep inner turmoil, according to this chapter?
Well, the source details how he developed this really strict personal regimen. And it wasn't just, eat your greens and get some exercise. No, it was much more integrated. It included very specific dietary rules tied into astrological ideas. Regular walking, yes, but also engaging with music in particular ways, performing certain ritual manipulations, and critically, practicing astrological magic.
So the magic wasn't separate, it was part of his wellness routine.
Exactly. The text presents it as deeply practical. It was an interwoven system he used to try and maintain his own very fragile balance, physical, mental, and cosmic. His personal suffering really became the furnace where some of his key philosophical and magical ideas were forged.
That makes a lot of sense. His life experience feeding directly into his thought. Okay, so from Ficino and his very personal struggles, the book pivots to Giordano Bruno, and the contrast feels pretty sharp, especially against that backdrop of emerging rationalism.
It really emphasizes that contrast. Bruno is described, according to the source, as belonging fundamentally to a phantasmic past.
Phantasmic past.
Yeah, a world rooted in mental acrobatics, highly developed mnemotechnics, those arts of memory we'll get into, and magic. The text even uses words like grotesque to suggest how strange and maybe even primitive this complex image-based way of thinking must have seemed to people who were embracing a more linear, rational way of knowing.
So the usual narrative is Bruno the visionary, ahead of his time, misunderstood. But this is saying he was misunderstood because he was rooted in something older, something being left behind.
That's precisely the argument the source makes. It explicitly says Bruno wasn't a man of the future, but was misunderstood because he represented this older intellectual tradition, a tradition maybe too subtle, too complex, too reliant on imagination for the new rationalism to really get its head around. The text even notes how a later philosopher like Hegel struggled with Bruno. He called Bruno's philosophy bacchantic, like wild, irrational, orgiastic.
Which sounds dismissive.
It does. And the text suggests maybe that was Hegel's way of sidestepping the challenge of actually engaging with Bruno's complex, phantasm-driven system.
Okay, this world of phantasms seems absolutely crucial then. For understanding Bruno and maybe the whole Renaissance mindset explored in these pages, how does the book define it? What are phantasms in this context?
They are foundational. The text really digs into the Renaissance arts of memory here. And it makes a distinction. There's a simpler, utilitarian kind, just techniques for memorizing lists or speeches, basically.
Like memory palaces.
Sort of, yeah, that's related. But there was also this more universal, more profound art of memory. And this is what's key for Bruno and Ficino.
Okay.
This universal art, presented as continuing medieval traditions, aimed to do something much bigger. It aimed to translate the entire world, or at least its underlying intelligible order, into a kind of make-believe language made of phantasms' vivid mental images.
A language of images.
Exactly. And conversely, it was about translating abstract real truths, philosophical concepts, divine principles, into that same phantasmic language. Why? To engrave them onto the soul's mirror.
The soul's mirror.
Which the text identifies specifically as the pneuma. This is a really important concept here.
Right, let's pause on pneuma, because it's not spirit like a ghost, is it? It's more substantial.
Yeah, precisely. You had to think of pneuma in this Renaissance context as a kind of subtle, almost physical, spiritual substance. It's the bridge, the intermediary between our gross material body and the pure intellect or soul.
Okay.
It's the medium through which celestial influences, like from the stars, are thought to act on us. And importantly, it's also the medium through which our internal states, our thoughts and phantasms, can potentially affect the external world, or at least be affected by it. It's where phantasms live and operate.
Got it. So engraving truths onto the pneuma using phantasms means fixing them in this fundamental, subtle layer of reality within us, making them part of our very being, almost.
That's the core idea, yes. That's the mechanism the text describes for this universal art of memory. And the imaginary nature of these phantasms was vital. It wasn't enough just to think about, say, justice abstractly.
You needed an image.
You needed to translate justice into a striking, maybe even bizarre visual image, a phantasm, and then mentally place that image in a specific location within a memorized structure, like a room in your memory palace.
Why did that work? Why the image?
Because that vivid imagined quality made the abstract concept sticky. It engraved it firmly onto the pneuma, making it accessible not just to dry logic, but to a deeper part of the soul. Ready for what they call discursive reasoning, or step-by-step thinking, to then grab onto and work with.
And the book mentions this took serious effort, like intense focus and solitude.
Oh, absolutely. The source really emphasizes the intense concentration required. To effectively create these phantasmic images, place them in their mental locations, and meditate on their meaning, you needed to be completely undisturbed.
No distractions.
Right. The text lists specific places suited for this mnemonic activity. A quiet church, a cemetery, a deserted palace, or just being completely alone at home. You'd meticulously memorize parts of this place, real or imagined corners, statues, architectural details. And then you'd superimpose your sequences of phantasmic images onto those locations. Images corresponding to a poem you wanted to learn, or the virtues and vices, or whatever complex content you were working with. The more unusual or emotionally charged the image, the better it stuck, the better it engraved the content.
This idea gets pushed to an incredible extreme with Giulio Camilla's project for a literal physical memory theater.
Oh, Camilla's theater. Yes, the text describes this, and it's just fascinating. It shows how deeply they believed in the real power of these phantasms.
But who was Camillo?
He wasn't some fringe figure. The source notes he was a respected professor, not a charlatan, and he envisioned building an actual wooden structure, but not for plays. It was meant to be a physical, spatial representation of the rules of this universal, phantasmic language, a kind of walk-in encyclopedia of reality, structured according to these mnemonic and symbolic principles.
Wow. How would it work?
The idea was, by physically arranging images and symbols representing fundamental concepts in their relationships, you could create a space where someone could literally stand inside this system of knowledge and meditate upon abstract truths directly. Grasp them through spatial relationships and imagery, maybe bypassing linear reading or argument altogether.
Did he get funding? That sounds ambitious.
Apparently, he was incredibly persuasive. The text says he actually gained the interest and financial backing of King Francis I of France.
No way.
Yeah, but it seems the grand vision was never fully realized.
What happened?
The text says Camillo never actually finished constructing the theater. He died in Milan in 1544. And while he impressed some serious scholars, the book mentions Vilius Vucamus, who corresponded with Erasmus. He also faced ridicule.
Why the mockery?
Well, the source speculates it might have come from humanists, maybe like Erasmus himself, who just couldn't grasp the profound philosophical and mnemonic system Camillo was trying to embody. They couldn't see past the perhaps eccentric exterior to the complex theory underneath. Maybe it just seemed impractical or nonsensical to a different intellectual mindset.
There's this great Latin phrase the text brings up to kind of tie all these ideas together. The art of memory, phantasms, love, magic. Io cari serio et studiosissime ludere.
Yes, that phrase is brilliant. And this is where Couliano makes a really insightful connection.
Tell us about it.
Okay, so the phrase translates roughly as joking seriously and playing assiduously. Ficino apparently used it to describe the Socratic method, drawing on Xenophon. It suggests a kind of playful seriousness in dialogue and inquiry.
Okay.
But the source argues this concept goes much deeper. It suggests this idea of seeing intellectual and spiritual pursuits as a kind of game for children, ludus puerorum, that you absolutely must play with intense seriousness, captures the very essence of all these phantasmic processes discussed in the chapter.
All of them.
Yeah.
Eros, memory, magic.
Yes. Eros, the art of memory, magic, even alchemy, they're all presented as different facets of this serious game played with phantasms.
So it's not dismissing them as trivial, but saying they operate on a level that needs imagination, needs playfulness, but also demands incredible rigor. You have to learn the rules of the phantasm game.
Precisely that. The text suggests it's like the benevolent unconscious, or maybe some higher intelligence, sets up this game of reality expressed through these phantasms, these images and desires. And our task, as humans seeking understanding or influence, is to play assiduously, to apply ourselves with total seriousness, to learn the rules of how these phantasms operate, how they connect, how they influence us and the world.
And only by mastering this phantasmic language can we actually understand the reality it reveals.
Exactly. Only then can we respond appropriately to the disclosures it makes and actually use the insights gained through these imaginative, playful, yet deeply serious processes.
Yeah.
It's this unique combination, profound truth-seeking through rigorous imaginative play, that really defines the whole framework being explored here.
Okay, so taking that idea, engaging with reality through this serious game of phantasms, let's look at how it applies to passionate pursuits. The text turns specifically to Giordano Bruno's work, Heroic Furors.
Yes, the Eroici Furori. It's all about that intense, almost frenzied pursuit of higher knowledge or divine love.
And right away, the book points out some, well, potentially scandalous ways people rate it.
It does. The source notes that Bruno himself apparently considered calling the work cantical, like the Song of Solomon, but he changed his mind.
Why?
He explicitly said, according to the text, that he changed the title specifically to avoid being accused of writing about ordinary sexual love, love for a specific flesh and blood person. He wanted it understood as a higher heroic intellectual love.
Which naturally led some people to suspect that's exactly what it was about.
Predictably, yes. The text mentions a specific attempt much later in 1920 by someone named A. Sarno. Sarno argued that the poems inside Heroic Furors were actually inspired by Bruno's feelings for Queen Elizabeth I.
Really?
Yeah, and that Bruno only later added the philosophical commentary to give it this veneer of lyrical metaphysics, essentially covering up a more personal romantic inspiration.
How did Bruno himself respond to that kind of interpretation, according to the book? Did he address it?
Oh, he addressed it vehemently. The source states, Bruno rejected this, reading the idea was about love for a specific woman as a terrible insult. He found it degrading to his philosophical purpose.
Okay.
And then comes that really bizarre specific detail. In the process of rejecting this mundane interpretation, Bruno goes on, according to the text, to explicitly exclude all English women from the category of woman as he meant it in his work.
Exclude them how?
He calls them nymphs, not women. And he says they are separated from the women of continental Europe, not just by the channel, but ontologically, by their very being.
Ontologically separate. That's quite a statement. What does the text suggest he meant? Is that a compliment? Like, they're divine beings?
Well, the source calls the claim ambiguous. It could be read as a strange kind of compliment, maybe elevating them to some semi-divine status. But the text quickly reminds us that Bruno was generally not an admirer of 16th century English society or culture. He could be quite critical. So the meaning is layered, maybe even deliberately obscure.
Okay.
However, the text does say that among these uniquely classified nymphs, one figure stood out dramatically, the unique Diana. And this Diana, Bruno makes clear, is Queen Elizabeth herself. She's shown, he says, like the sun among the lesser planets.
So Elizabeth gets special status even among the nymphs. This connects to how Bruno uses visual imagery in heroic fures, doesn't it? These mnemonic images or statues, impreza.
Exactly. The text explains these impreza were crucial. They weren't just illustrations, they were phantasmic supports, designed to anchor the complex, abstract, philosophical ideas he was presenting. They functioned within that art of memory framework.
Can you give an example from the text?
Sure. The text mentions the third impreza, a nude adolescent boy standing in a meadow looking up at celestial buildings with the motto, Mutuo fulcimer, we are mutually supported. Or another one, the seventh escutcheon, showing a sun surrounded by concentric circles, motto, circuit. These weren't random. They were deliberate visual tools, packed with symbolic meaning, meant to make the metaphysical concepts graspable through potent imagery.
And the central image, the overarching allegory for this whole heroic pursuit of truth or love, is the myth of Actaeon.
Yes, the myth of Actaeon spying on the goddess Diana bathing. This becomes one of the most vivid and crucial allegories Bruno uses in this part of his work, as described here.
Remind us of the myth quickly.
Actaeon, the hunter, stumbles upon Diana, goddess of the hunt and the moon, bathing naked with her nymphs. As punishment for seeing her divinity unveiled, she transforms him into a stag, and then, tragically, his own hunting dogs, not recognizing him, tear him apart.
A brutal story.
Very. And Bruno uses this powerful image, Diana, Actaeon as a stag, his own hounds devouring him to symbolize the intense, dangerous, transformative process of the soul seeking divine knowledge or truth. The source notes Bruno draws on Ovid's Metamorphoses and even contemporary hunting manuals to ground the imagery.
Okay, so let's break down the symbolism according to the text. What do Actaeon's dogs represent?
The dogs, according to Bruno's interpretation presented here, represent the hunter's own thoughts. As the seeker, Actaeon, aims high, pursuing lofty spiritual prey, his own thoughts, his intellectual faculties turn against his former self. They pursue and ultimately kill him, his old identity, with their cruel and greedy bites.
So the process of intense seeking consumes the seeker.
It transforms him utterly. It dissolves the old limited self. That's the idea. The very tools of the hunt turn on the hunter.
And Diana, she's obviously more than just the goddess of the hunt in this allegory.
Oh, vastly more. The text stresses how complex Bruno's Diana figure is. It says she presents multiple aspects which, though forming an indissoluble unity, are nevertheless capable of being analyzed one by one.
Okay, like what?
She simultaneously represents nature itself, the physical universe. She represents the moon with its cycles in connection to the sublunary world. And crucially for Bruno's context, she explicitly represents Queen Elizabeth.
Nature, moon, queen, all in one image.
Yes, and her specific pose emerging half-naked from the water is symbolic too. It means reality, Nature, truth, have a visible part, accessible through contemplation, but also a hidden deeper part that remains veiled, the water she emerges from. That symbolizes the sensory world, the world of appearances.
Even her physical features described in the image carry meaning.
Absolutely. The text details the symbolism. Her alabaster skin signifies divine beauty. Her purple lips or breasts represent active creative power. Her golden hair symbolizes divine wisdom. So every element of this phantasmic image, this mental statue, is packed with layers of metaphysical meaning.
So how does the text ultimately define this Brunian Diana?
It gives a really comprehensive definition from Bruno's perspective. Diana is nature, the universe, the world. She's the image of Amphitrite, the source of all things, the origin of all numbers, of all species, of all causes. Ultimately, she is one, the entity itself, the entity that is truth itself, truth which is intelligential nature in which the sun and splendor of higher nature shine. She's the ultimate object of the heroic quest.
Wow. Okay. And Actaeon, the hunter, pursuing this incredibly complex Diana, who does he represent?
The text says Actaeon's symbolic meaning is simpler. He's the phantasm of the subject, the individual soul on its quest for truth. This quest uses both the rational parts of the soul, the intellect, and the irrational parts, desire, intuition.
But there's another layer to Actaeon, too.
Yes, importantly, Actaeon also represents the social man, the person caught up in the everyday world, burdened by its limitations, its twaddle, its prejudices. These social aspects are seen as obstacles, things that must be transcended or consumed in the pure pursuit of Diana truth.
Okay, so pulling it all together. The core insight from the central allegory, as the book presents it, is that Bruno uses this incredibly rich, multi-layered image Diana as universe truth Queen Elizabeth and Actaeon's fate to show that the passionate, heroic pursuit of this ultimate truth is inherently self-consuming. It leads to the transformation, the dissolution of the seeker's limited everyday self, devoured by their own intensified thoughts and desires focused on that ultimate goal.
That's it, exactly.
And he very deliberately wove Queen Elizabeth into this ultimate object of desire and pursuit.
That strategic element is crucial, and the text really highlights it. Bruno wasn't just philosophizing in a vacuum. He was writing for a specific audience, the English court.
An audience skilled in reading symbols.
Highly skilled. People like Sir Philip Sidney, Fulk Greville, Walter Raleigh, George Chapman. They would have immediately understood the association of Diana with their queen. It was common symbolism. So Bruno's complex allegory cleverly served two functions at once.
Which were?
One, to introduce his challenging metaphysical system and his ideas about the art of memory and phantasms. And two, to offer profound, multi-layered flattery to Queen Elizabeth, linking her to the highest object of intellectual and spiritual striving.
A smart political move, potentially. But the text says this brilliant strategy didn't quite pay off for Bruno in the end.
No, unfortunately for him, it seems it didn't. The source suggests that complicated political situations, possibly involving the disgrace of his patron, Sir Philip Sidney, forced Bruno to leave England.
Before he could benefit.
Exactly. He left, the text says, without getting the results he might have hoped for, without garnering the vainly awaited fruits of his praise from the queen or the court. His intellectual and symbolic gamble, while brilliant, didn't achieve the practical outcome he likely desired.
This section really hammers home the connection they saw between these passionate pursuits, love, truth-seeking, and what they called magic. It frames the magician as a kind of hunter, too.
Yes, this is where Couliano states the identity of love and magic most explicitly within this Renaissance framework. The source describes the magician, just like the lover pursuing the beloved, as a hunter.
Using similar tools.
Using the same conceptual tools. The magician casts nets, rita, and puts out phantasmic bait, or decoys. The text lists the Latin terms Bruno used. Ilex, ilicebra, esca. These are lures designed to capture precious game.
But the game itself is different for the lover versus the magician.
That's the distinction the text makes. For the lover, the goal, the game, is getting influence or control over the pneumatic mechanism, that subtle spirit-body complex of the specific beloved individual.
And for the magician?
For the magician, the scope is often broader. The game might be influencing external objects, manipulating other individuals, affecting society as a whole, or even invoking and binding supernatural entities, demons, spirits, heroes. The method using phantasmic lures and nets is fundamentally the same, but the target and the scale of the operation differ.
And the whole process is talked about using words like to bind, vincere. And the techniques are chains, vincula.
Precisely. Bruno, in his writings discussed here, really takes this concept of binding, of enchantment through vincula, to its logical conclusion. The absolute core principle behind how these chains work is by acting directly on the target's phantasms.
Their imagination, their mental images.
Exactly. And this relies on a fundamental belief in the continuity, the connection between the individual pneuma, the spirit within a person, and the universal pneuma, the spirit pervading the cosmos. Magic, in this view, is fundamentally a phantasmic process that utilizes this connection. It works through imagination and this subtle spirit medium.
Okay, so if magic works by binding through phantasms, how do these chains get in? Are the physical senses, sight, hearing, the main doorways?
This is such a crucial point the text makes, and it really flips our usual modern assumptions. Couliano emphasizes Bruno's view here. Sight and hearing are only secondary gateways.
Secondary.
Yes, as secondary routes through which the hunter of souls, the magician, or the lover can try to introduce these chains and lures. The main entrance, the porta et principios additus, as the text quotes, for all magical processes, is fantasy, the imagination itself.
So not just important, but primary.
It's explicitly called the only gateway, sola porta, for influencing internal mental states. And even more significantly, fantasy itself is described as the ultimate chain, the chain of chains, the vinculum vinculorum.
Wow. The imagination is the master key, the ultimate binding force.
That's the core of the theory presented here. And the text adds another layer. The power of the imagination, of fantasy, is amplified by the cogitative faculty, meaning our ability to think about, dwell on, and process those images. It's not just the image itself, but how the mind engages with it. The source reinforces this by citing that classic philosophical idea they inherited. Nothing is in the intellect that was not first in the senses.
And nothing reaches the intellect from the senses except through the intermediary of fantasy.
Right, exactly. Quod prius non furit in sensu, sine phantasiae interventu. So fantasy isn't just the target for influence. It's an essential step in how we perceive and understand anything. That makes it doubly powerful, central to both knowing and being influenced.
Okay, given that fantasy is this master gateway, does that mean magic works the same way on everyone? If you understand this chain of chains, can you just use one technique universally?
Absolutely not. And this is where Bruno's theory, as presented by Couliano, seems strikingly modern, almost psychological in a way. The source emphasizes Bruno's explicit recognition of individual differences. Yes, there are broad categories, age, maybe physiognomy, but within those, individuals vary tremendously. Therefore, the magical bonds, the vincula, must also vary significantly.
One size does not fit all.
Definitely not. The text quotes Bruno saying two individuals never correspond completely, so a single, universal magical technique just won't cut it. The approach has to be tailored to the specific person.
You need to understand their unique internal landscape, their specific phantasms and desires.
Precisely. The text gives concrete examples of this variation. The kind of beauty that might deeply affect Socrates might leave Plato cold. The general public, the multitude, responds to different lures than the intellectual elite. Males have different tastes than females. Bruno even distinguishes between what attracts virgins versus promiscuous women. These differences mean the magician has to adapt the specific phantasms, the specific chains they use. But the text notes, the constant across all these variations is the fundamental quality of that chain of chains, Eros, which is always linked to sensual pleasure and the power of fantasy.
The text also talks about the different kinds of vincula, the chains, right? Depending on the relationship.
Yes, it really stresses the multiplicity of these bonds. Couliano quotes Bruno again. It is with a different bond that we embrace sons, father, sister, wife, a woman, the libertine, and a friend. The type of connection dictates the type of chain.
And it goes beyond just human relationships.
Absolutely. The broader principle stated is, multiple is the semen, multiple is Venus, multiples is love, multiple is the bond, multiplex semen, multiplex Venus, multiplex amor, multiplex vinculum. This underlines the idea that attachments, influences, bonds exist in countless forms, between humans and superiors, equals, inferiors, even between humans and non-human things, natural objects, or even artificial creations. Things can become bound to other things through fantasy and desire.
And there's that really unexpected detail about physical continents playing a role.
Yes, that's a fascinating little twist in the text. It notes that Bruno seems to refer to a belief maybe drawing from figures like Van Helmont, that physical continence, sexual abstinence, could actually enhance the ability to forge these magical bonds, these vincula.
How would that work? Conserving energy.
That seems to be the idea, yes. By abstaining physically, you perhaps conserve or transmute the potent energy associated with Eros, making it available for psychic or magical work. But here's the counterintuitive part.
Go on.
While recommending physical continence on the psychic level, Bruno apparently advises actively producing voluptuous phantasms, creating intense erotic mental images.
Why?
The purpose, according to the text, is to deliberately use these powerful internal imaginative creations to directly influence the subject's inner consciousness, their pneuma, and thus create those magical bonds.
So it's like physical control paired with intense psychic stimulation, channeling the conserved energy through targeted imagination to create the magical effect. That's really specific.
It is. It shows how sophisticated their thinking was about the interplay between the physical body, that subtle pneumatic spirit, and the directive power of the imagination, all harnessed for the practical purpose of influence, which they termed magic.
Okay, let's dig deeper into the mechanics then. The text brings in the idea of spirit pneuma as this crucial intermediary substance again.
Yes, building on that, the source explains spirit, or pneuma, is seen as the go-between. It links the gross physical body of the world to the non-material soul or intellect, and it's within this spirit and acting through it that other entities operate, the stars, demons, angels.
Right.
And to make your own human spirit more effective for magic, more receptive to helpful celestial influences, more compatible with the spirit of the world, you had to purify it. It needed to be purged of its filth.
And this filth wasn't just like physical dirt.
No, the text is very clear on that. The stains or impurities affecting the spirit weren't just from bad food or drink. They could also be caused often by the soul, by the skin, by clothing, lodgings, and the surrounding air. It's a holistic view of purity.
Like spiritual hygiene.
Exactly. This concept of pneumatic purging, cleansing this subtle body, is linked by the source to earlier thinkers like Synesius. It's about tuning your inner instrument, your pneuma, to resonate better with cosmic energies and become a more potent vehicle for magical action.
This leads directly into astrological magic, doesn't it? Particularly Ficino's methods.
It does. Ficino's astrological magic, as Couliano described it here, drew heavily on influential texts like the Picatrix, that famous Arabic grimoire.
And what did his approach involve?
It involved using specific material substances, things like precious stones, worn as talismans or maybe even ingested in potions, specific herbs, remedies, ointments, even parts of animals. Why these particular things?
Because they held planetary power.
Because they were believed to possess inherent occult qualities, virtues, occultasis. These qualities were thought to be conferred upon them by the stars, by specific planets. The text quotes the Latin, Res naturalis accruere etiam artificiosae habent virtutes a stellis occultasi. Natural and artificial things have hidden virtues from the stars.
So by using these sympathetic objects, you could attract that stellar influence.
Precisely. By preparing and using these substances correctly, wearing the talisman, applying the ointment, consuming the remedy the human spirit could align itself with, attract and utilize the specific influences associated with those planets.
And different planets were linked to different areas of life.
Yes, the text lays out the standard associations. Saturn for deep philosophy, occultism, melancholy. Jupiter for natural philosophy, law, politics. Mars for strength, courage, conflict. The Sun and Mercury for eloquence, reason, music. Venus for love, beauty, festivities. And the Moon for growth, nourishment, the body.
So you'd choose your materials based on the influence you wanted.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And astrological remedies, specific herbs, poultices, were prescribed based on which planet was thought to rule the afflicted part of the body. The source explicitly states that pharmacology, the use of medicinal substances, was considered a major branch of magic. They weren't separate fields.
And getting the timing right was absolutely essential.
Critically important. The text stresses the absolute necessity of identifying propitious times, tempora opportuna. The effectiveness of gathering herbs, brewing potions, or carving talismans depended entirely on the precise astrological conditions, the position of the relevant planet in the zodiac, its position in the celestial houses, its aspects to other planets.
Can you give an example?
The text mentions attracting Venusian qualities. To do this, you might use things associated with Venus, like turtle doves, pigeons, or wagtails. But you'd only collect them, or use parts of them, during a time when Venus was astrologically strong and well aspected. It required detailed astrological knowledge. The text also mentions other tools, like the strophalos, a spinning gold disc engraved with symbols used by theurgists while chanting to communicate with spirits.
Okay, so that's celestial magic. But the chapter also goes into demons, who also operate in the spirit realm.
Yes, it covers the demonic side, too. The text explains the common Neoplatonist view, which generally divided demons into two camps. Beneficent ones dwelling in the higher celestial spheres, and malevolent ones inhabiting the lower spheres closer to Earth and humanity.
But not everyone agreed.
No.
Yeah.
It mentions Michael Psellos, who was a Christian Platonist. He took a much stricter line, considering all demons to be fundamentally evil. Psellos described them as having tenuous, subtle bodies made of pneuma, but unlike the radiant bodies of angels, demonic bodies were dim, shadowy.
And the text includes some pretty graphic details about demons attributed to Psellos via a hermit named Mark of Chersonesus.
It does. It recounts Mark's doctrine, reported by Celis, which held some really peculiar beliefs about demonic physiology and behavior.
Like what?
Like demons being able to ejaculate physical semen, being born inside animals, having distinct limbs, and needing to feed on spirit and bodily fluids, absorbing them like sponges. Mark, presented as an expert on demonology, even categorized them into 6 types based on their element or habitat: fiery, aerial, terrestrial, aquatic, subterranean, and light-fleeing, lucifugis.
And their main activities vary depending on the type.
According to this system, yes. The sublunar demons, the aerial and terrestrial ones closest to humans, were primarily focused on spiritual harm. Their main goal was depraving the soul by means of fantasies and cogitations.
Influencing thoughts and imagination again.
Exactly. Specifically, the aerial and terrestrial types were said to specialize in provoking erotic fantasies. The other types, aquatic, subterranean, etc., were seen as more materialistic, maybe causing physical harm or interacting with the physical world more directly.
And they could change shape.
Yes, the text explains that their fluid pneumatic essence allowed them to assume any form or color they wished in order to deceive humans. They appeared in phantasmic guises tailored to trick or tempt.
This idea of demons working primarily through fantasies seems to connect directly to the discussion of witchcraft later in the section.
It really does. The text moves on to discuss elements very common in witchcraft trial accounts and folklore. Things like the witch's special ointment box, the pixidariae, and of course the infamous broomstick, the bacillariae.
And it looks at the ointment recipes.
Yes, it notes that historical analysis of surviving recipes for these flying ointments often reveals the inclusion of potent active compounds derived from plants in the nightshade family.
Like what kind of plants?
Things like datura, thornapple, belladonna, deadly nightshade, henbane, mandrake. These plants contain powerful tropane alkaloids, hyoscyamine, scopolamine, atropine, which are well-known narcotics and potent hallucinogens capable of inducing delirium and altered states of consciousness.
And the text offers a specific, almost pharmacological theory about the broomstick's role. It wasn't just symbolic.
It suggests it might have been highly practical. The text explains that extracts from these nightshade plants, particularly when mixed with fat, as ointments often were, can be absorbed through the skin and become biologically active.
Transdermal absorption.
Exactly. And the source points out that some of the most sensitive areas for this kind of absorption are the mucous membranes and thin skin of the vulva, and also the armpits. This, the text posits, provides a very plausible explanation for the apparently incongruous use of the bacillariae.
Applying the hallucinogenic ointment to those specific areas using the broomstick handle or a similar applicator.
Precisely. It suggests a direct physiological mechanism for delivering these psychoactive compounds into the bloodstream.
So the argument being presented here is that some of the classic experiences reported by accused witches, the sensation of flying, traveling vast distances to the sabbat, having vivid, often terrifying or erotic encounters with demons or the devil, these might actually have been powerful drug-induced hallucinations, triggered by absorbing these plant alkaloids through the skin.
The text strongly supports this interpretation. It offers a potential material explanation, grounded in pharmacology, for experiences that were understood at the time as supernatural or demonic. And it even backed this up with Bruno's own writing.
Bruno wrote about this.
Yes. The source highlights an account from Bruno's Sigillus Sigillorum that had apparently been overlooked for centuries. Bruno describes what he calls a folk practice among uncivilized people.
What did they do?
He says they would eat certain bitter grasses, anoint their entire bodies with fat, and then expose themselves nude at night, perhaps near a fire. Bruno explains that this process generated intense internal heat, causing the fat to penetrate the skin, which then filled the receptacles of carnal desire and produced a kind of artificial semen.
Okay.
This physical stimulation, combined with what Bruno calls venereal meditations, likely induced or enhanced by the substances ingested or absorbed, led them into a state of extreme psychophysical excitement. In this state, they mistook their own phantasmic cogitations, their vivid internal imagery and sensations, for real events.
So they felt like they were really experiencing these things.
Yes. Bruno describes them experiencing a very powerful, phantasmic enjoyment all night long, becoming utterly convinced they had spent the night in intense, voluptuous couplings or other fantastical activities. The text concludes that this account, coming from Bruno himself, seems to confirm that many practitioners accused of sorcery might have been seeking primarily intense psychosexual pleasure, facilitated by the cutaneous absorption of hallucinogenic substances.
That's a really striking perspective. It bridges the gap between historical witchcraft accounts and an understanding of psychoactive drugs and their profound effects on imagination and perception. The text also touches briefly on modern interpretations, mentioning Geza Roheim.
It does. Roheim, the psychoanalyst and anthropologist, famously suggested interpreting magic, particularly shamanistic practices, as a form of institutionalized schizophrenia.
But the text pushes back on that.
It pushes back on a direct, simple equation. While acknowledging there can be analogies, Couliano argues there's a crucial difference. The magician, generally speaking, retains awareness. They understand that the phantasmagoria they're working with, the visions or entities, operate only on the terrain belonging to phantasms within the realm of imagination, even if they believe that realm has real power.
Whereas the schizophrenic loses that distinction.
Exactly. The schizophrenic typically loses the ability to distinguish between internal phantasms and external consensus reality. The source even notes that Bruno himself explicitly warned practitioners, students of these phantasmic arts, about the dangers of losing their mental balance, of getting lost in the imaginal realm.
So not schizophrenia, but maybe analogies to psychoanalysis.
Yes, so the text suggests that while magic isn't institutionalized schizophrenia, there are interesting parallels between certain magical techniques, especially Bruno's methods for manipulating consciousness through phantasms, and some aspects of psychoanalytic practice, particularly in working with the unconscious and symbolic imagery to effect change or healing.
It's just fascinating how these Renaissance thinkers were trying to build these systematic frameworks. They were trying to understand and actively manipulate internal states, melancholy, memory, desire, and perceived external influences, blurring lines we now draw sharply between psychology, chemistry, spirituality, and magic, all centered on this potent concept of the phantasm and the pneuma.
It really was a holistic system, wasn't it? Where the connections we've severed were seen as fundamentally real and operational. They were grappling with the nature of consciousness, reality, and influence, using the tools and concepts they had, and imagination was right at the heart of it, seen as a primary active force.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly. How did the powers that be, the legal and religious authorities, view all this magical activity? The text brings in a treatise by Paul Guerlain.
Yes, Guerlain wrote an influential treatise on heresy and magic around 1536. The text presents him as attempting to classify different magical practices based on how serious or illegal they were considered.
Were there distinctions? Wasn't all magic condemned?
Not exactly. According to Guerlain's framework as presented here, he made distinctions. For instance, certain kinds of demonic invocations, specifically, commanding demons ad modum imperia, like a master giving orders, which Bruno apparently associated with controlling lesser demons. Guerlain classified this as sacrilegious. Bad, yes, offensive to God, but not automatically heretical.
Okay, so sacrilege wasn't heresy. What was always heretical?
According to Guerlain, foretelling the future, any form of divination was always considered heretical. That crossed a fundamental line.
And the book suggests Bruno was acutely aware of these legal categories and had to navigate them.
Absolutely. Given Bruno's deep immersion in occult traditions, Couliano argues he was undoubtedly familiar with these kinds of semi-official classifications, including Guerlain's. The text suggests Bruno might have implicitly disagreed with Guerlain's blanket condemnation of all divination, perhaps believing some higher forms could be legitimate or even beneficent.
But he still had to operate within that framework.
It seems so. Despite his possible disagreements, Bruno's own ways of categorizing magic in his writings seem to acknowledge and work within these existing legal and theological boundaries, even while he might propose different criteria for judging guilt. For example, the text points out Bruno seemed generally more critical of hands-on demonomagic than Guerlain was. But then he had to concede that his own preferred form of magic, which he sometimes called mathematical magic, likely involving complex calculations, symbols, maybe astrology, wasn't entirely separable from processes that could involve demons or spirits. This complexity forced him, the text argues, to essentially accept Guerlain's distinction, hoping his own practices would be judged merely sacrilegious, a serious offense but maybe not capital, rather than outright heretical. It was a dangerous tightrope to walk.
Definitely sounds like it. The chapter then dedicates a good chunk of space to another major figure, Johannes Trithemius. His life story, as presented here, seems almost magically driven itself.
Trithemius' biography, as recounted in the text, is extraordinary. It reads like something almost fated, deeply intertwined with the supernatural forces he studied.
How did it start?
He was born Johannes Heidenberg. His stepfather apparently opposed his passionate desire for learning. So, unable to study conventionally, Trithemius turned to what the text calls the extreme methods of all oppressed people. Intense fasting and prayer.
And something happened.
According to his own account, yes. After these spiritual practices, he had a powerful nocturnal vision. A young man dressed in white, interpreted it as an angel, appeared and offered him a choice between two tablets. One had writing on it, the other had painted figures and images.
And he chose.
He chose the tablet with the painted figures. The text interprets this choice as symbolically sealing his destiny. He was destined to become a master not of simple literacy, but of the deeper arts associated with images, artificial memory, and magic, both fundamentally reliant on manipulating phantasms.
And did things change for him after that vision?
Incredibly quickly, according to the account. The very next day, he supposedly had the opportunity to learn the alphabet and became fluent in reading German within a month. He then rapidly mastered Latin and Greek. His intellectual path opened dramatically.
And he became an abbot very young.
Astonishingly young, by the age of just 23 in 1483. The story goes that a sudden snowstorm forced him to take shelter at the Benedictine convent of Sponheim. The monks there were supposedly so impressed by his learning and piety that they elected him abbot almost immediately. The text emphasizes how remarkably swift and seemingly improbable this rise was.
Wow. And he's most famous for the library he built at Sponheim, right?
Yes. The text highlights his library as a truly monumental achievement. It calls it unparalleled at the beginning of the 16th century. Trithemius was absolutely relentless in acquiring books, buying them, exchanging them, and crucially, having his monks meticulously copy and bind rare, often unique manuscripts.
How big did it get?
It grew exponentially. From just 48 volumes when he arrived in 1483 to nearly 2,000 volumes by 1505. It became a mandatory stop, a pilgrimage site, for humanist scholars traveling through Germany. Trithemius himself described it, in Latin, as containing books that were not common but rare, hidden, secret, and wondrous. Rarorum, abditorum, secretorum, mirandorumque.
And the strong implication in the text is that this library housed some of the most important and potentially most dangerous occult texts of the time.
Absolutely. The source argues that Trithemius almost certainly used this incredible, unique collection to deepen his own knowledge of occultism, perhaps revisiting it specifically when writing his work against witchcraft, the Antipellus Maleficarum. It suggests his condemnation of dark arts was informed by intimate knowledge.
What kind of books are we talking about?
The text lists a veritable who's who of foundational grimoires and magical texts potentially held there. The Bicatrix, the Sephiroziel, a key Kabbalistic work on angels and magic, writings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, King Solomon, Albert the Great, drawing on ancient Egyptian, Greek, Hebrew, and Arabic sources. These books covered everything from demona magic and necromancy to astromagic, alchemy, and complex calculating arts related to divination or cryptography. This library was undoubtedly the engine behind the growing legend of Trithemius the Sorcerer.
And how did that specific legend, Trithemius as a sorcerer, actually get started, according to the book?
The text pinpoints a specific incident in 1499. Trithemius sent a letter to a close friend, Arnoldus Bostius, the prior of a monastery in Ghent. This letter apparently contained coded messages, likely using techniques Trithemius would later detail in his infamous book, Steganography.
Okay.
Tragically, Bostius died very soon after receiving the letter. The new prior, perhaps suspicious or curious, decided to decipher and read Trithemius' private coded message, and crucially, he then showed it to others.
Spreading the secret.
Exactly. This act of revealing Trithemius' use of secret, potentially magical communication methods seems to be what ignited the persistent rumors and built the foundation for his lasting reputation as a master magician, someone dealing in hidden arts.
Which brings us to steganography itself. That sounds like the key text for understanding his alleged magic.
It absolutely is. The text describes steganography, which literally means hidden writing, as outlining methods for achieving long-distance communication, not just through code, but through the use of spirit intermediaries, angels or demons acting as messengers.
Can you give an example of how this worked based on the text?
Yes, the source provides a specific example from the book involving Saturn's angel, Oriphiel. The procedure involved creating a specific ritual image of the spirit. Trithemius describes Oriphiel vividly as a nude, bearded old man riding a bull, holding a book and a pen. Then you would perform a specific invocation directed at this image. The belief was that the summoned spirit, Oriphiel in this case, would then carry your message instantly over vast distances to the intended recipient.
Wow, and could anyone do this?
The text notes that, according to Trithemius, the carefully crafted images could be reused, and the method could theoretically work for anyone who meticulously followed the prescribed ritual instructions. It presented it as a learnable technology, albeit a magical one.
And what was Trithemius' own stated motivation? Why did he want this power of spirit communication? What was his goal?
The source quotes directly from a surviving fragment of steganography, putting the quote in all capital letters for emphasis. Trithemius states that his deepest wish, apparently revealed to him by supernatural presences he consulted, was to know everything that was happening in the world. Et omnia, quae viunt in mundo, scare poteris.
A kind of magical omniscience, instantaneous global knowledge.
That seems to be exactly it. An almost godlike desire to have immediate access to all current events across the globe, facilitated by these spirit messengers.
So if he supposedly had this powerful method, why was steganography seemingly left unfinished? Or why were parts maybe destroyed?
The text connects this directly back to that legal framework we discussed, the one articulated by Grelandi. The source hypothesizes that the final missing part of steganography almost certainly dealt with methods for foretelling the future divination using these spirits.
Which was strictly heretical.
Exactly. Trithemius, being deeply knowledgeable about occult traditions and the laws surrounding them, would have known the extreme danger of writing down instructions for heretical divination. So the theory is he likely destroyed that specific, highly incriminating section himself to avoid prosecution for heresy.
But he kept the rest.
But he couldn't bring himself to destroy the earlier parts detailing the communication methods. These, while likely considered sacrilegious, weren't necessarily heretical, and he probably found them too fascinating or potentially useful. This would explain why the book survived in its incomplete state, and why, even incomplete, it was eventually placed on the Church's Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the list of forbidden books, cementing its reputation as a dangerous and powerful text.
And finally, the text wraps up this section by briefly contrasting Trithemius's apparent success, or at least his detailed system for spirit communication, with the struggles of another famous occultist, Cornelius Agrippa.
Yes, it offers a quick, slightly skeptical take on Agrippa. The source casts some doubt on Agrippa's own claims about his magical abilities or his easy collaboration with spirits.
How so?
It points to details from Agrippa's own biography, which suggest he actually had considerable difficulty getting helpful assistance from friendly spirits when he needed it. He apparently had to resort to more traditional, almost folk magic methods, like using biblical spells, even for relatively straightforward problems. The text gives the example of him trying to magically find out why a certain queen was angry with him.
Implying what?
Implying that if Agrippa had truly mastered the kind of high-level spirit communication Trithemius described in steganography, he presumably could have used that more sophisticated method rather than falling back on simpler spellcasting. It subtly reinforces the uniqueness and alleged power of Trithemius' system, while perhaps slightly deflating Agrippa's reputation. So when you pull back and look at this whole deep dive into just these, 30-odd pages of Couliano, it really paints this picture of a Renaissance world where imagination, where fantasy wasn't just, for art or poetry.
No, it was seen as the engine.
The fundamental engine, yes. The primary gateway, the vincularum, that chain of chains for both gaining knowledge through things like the art of memory and for wielding influence through what they called magic.
And all these intense human experiences, love, desire, melancholy, even the drive for healing or long-distance communication, they were all understood as operating through this shared medium, this pneumatic, phantasmic layer of reality.
That's the framework. Thinkers like Ficino, Bruno, Trithemius, they weren't just vaguely speculating. They were building these incredibly complex, interconnected systems.
Systems that use tools like astrological timing.
Specific substances believed to carry cosmic power, potent symbolic images designed to work on the imagination.
And even techniques that, if you look at them sideways, might seem weirdly similar to later ideas about psychological states or suggestion or even chemical influence on the brain.
Right, but all interpreted entirely through their own sophisticated lens of magic, spirit, pneuma, and the power of fantasy.
What's really striking is the ingenuity, the sheer complexity of their attempts to map and manipulate both the inner world, the mind, the soul, and the outer world they perceived.
And seeing these direct operational connections everywhere, between the stars and human health, between emotions and physical well-being, between imagination and the ability to actually affect reality.
And their explanations for things we still puzzle over today. The link between genius and melancholy, how memory actually works, even trying to make sense of bizarre subjective experiences like those reported in witchcraft trials, those explanations were deeply woven into this whole intricate system.
Which really brings us to a final, maybe unsettling thought. If the Renaissance saw phantasms, what we might loosely call imagination, subjective experience, mental imagery, if they saw these not just as passive reflections of reality, but as the fundamental gateway to both understanding reality and actively influencing it.
What does that challenge us to think about our own time?
Exactly. What does that perspective challenge us to consider about our own modern definitions of reality and influence? How might our current frameworks, scientific, psychological, philosophical, be shaped by unexamined assumptions, just as theirs were shaped by the concepts of pneuma and fantasy?
Are there other layers we're missing?
What other unseen phantasmic layers, what other modes of connection or influence might we be overlooking in our own world simply because they don't fit neatly into our current categories of physics or biology or psychology? Makes you wonder.
It certainly does. A really compelling thought to sit with. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the dangerous, complex, and utterly fascinating liaisons between love, magic, and the power of imagination in the Renaissance, as revealed in these crucial pages from Ioan Couliano's work. We hope you found it as intriguing and thought-provoking as we did.